The person you are becoming is ending the person you used to be. And no one warned you that would feel just like dying. Not in a metaphorical sense. Not in a poetic sense. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between the death of your identity and the death of your body. So when you begin stepping into your true self, every part of you resists. Every cell screams to stop, to retreat to the familiar version of yourself that once felt safe, even if it was slowly suffocating you. Carl Jung observed this transformation unfold in people. Not because the process itself was harmful, but because no one ever explained the true cost of becoming who you are meant to be. His patients often arrived at his office in crisis, convinced they were failing. They were losing relationships, losing drive, losing the ability to maintain the version of themselves that had worked for years. They believed they were breaking down. Jung saw something different. They were breaking open. Yet he also understood a truth that much of today's self-help culture refuses to face. Breaking open is one of the most excruciating experiences a person can endure, and pretending it isn't is a disservice to those going through it. Today, I'll explore what Jung uncovered about why stepping into your true self is so painful, the 3 major losses that make this process feel unbearable, and why the discomfort you're experiencing isn't a sign that something is wrong, but proof that something is finally profoundly right. Jung's insights into this suffering stem from a concept he devoted his entire career to: individuation. Individuation is a process of becoming psychologically whole by integrating all the parts of yourself you've been forced to reject, deny, or hide. On paper, it sounds inspiring. Become your true self, integrate your shadow, achieve wholeness. But Jung was candid about what this journey actually feels like from the inside, and it bears little resemblance to the calm, enlightened path most people imagine. True individuation demands dismantling the false self you constructed to survive. And that false self isn't simply a mask you can take off. It's wired into your nervous system, intertwined with your relationships, embedded in your career, and woven into every choice you've made over years or even decades. Authenticity doesn't happen cleanly. You must pull apart structures that are fused to living tissue. That tearing is where the pain arises. Jung noticed that most people enter individuation not by choice, but through crisis. Something falls apart, a relationship, a career, health, or even a belief system. In that collapse, the false self can no longer maintain itself. The persona you relied on begins to crack, and what's underneath starts pushing through, ready or not. This is why stepping into your true self rarely begins with inspiration. It begins with devastation. The life you built on a shaky foundation collapses, leaving you amidst the rubble, questioning who you are without the structure that once defined you. The first insight Jung uncovered about why this process is so agonizing is something almost nobody discusses openly. Becoming yourself requires mourning a person who never truly existed. The version of you your parents wanted. The version your culture approved of. The version that kept everyone comfortable. That version felt real. You spent years performing it, sacrificing genuine desires, authentic reactions, and real preferences to sustain it. Now, as you step into your true self, you must accept that the person you believe yourself to be, the one who earned approval, fit in, and knew their place, was a construction. It was a survival strategy, an elaborate performance you mistook for identity. This grief is unique because you are mourning something that was never alive. You are grieving a self that never existed, yet it's all you've ever known. Jung called this the persona, the mask we present to the world. But he understood that most people experience it not as a mask, but as themselves. So when individuation begins to strip it away, it doesn't feel like removing a mask. It feels like removing your face. Imagine someone who spent decades being responsible, reliable, never complaining, never prioritizing themselves. That wasn't a role they freely chose. It was survival. That was the version of themselves that earned love or at least tolerance. Now, something inside is rejecting that identity. They find themselves unable to perform it, waking up exhausted by the act without understanding why. They feel resentment toward the people they've long accommodated. Instead of seeing this as a beginning of authenticity, they often feel like they are becoming a bad person. Jung witnessed this repeatedly. Patients finally stepping into their real selves interpret the process as moral failure. They believed something was wrong with them because they could no longer sustain the false self. They felt guilty for having needs, ashamed for setting boundaries, and terrified that without the persona, no one would love the person underneath. And this fear was not unfounded. In many cases, the people around them had only ever loved the performance. The persona had been the price of admission to their relationships, and letting go of the persona meant risking everything they had built. This is the harsh reality of individuation, which Jung documented with complete honesty. Becoming yourself requires discovering which of your relationships were based on who you truly are and which were based on who you were pretending to be. You can't know the answer beforehand. You only find out by stepping into authenticity and seeing what endures. The second major source of pain Jung identified is confronting the shadow. Every trait you rejected, every emotion you labeled unacceptable, every impulse you buried because it threatened your persona, all of it lives in the shadow. Individuation demands that you face it not just theoretically or intellectually, but directly, in raw and destabilizing encounters with the parts of yourself you've long avoided. Jung recognized that the shadow doesn't just hold what we consider dark. It also holds what we see as incompatible with our identity. The people-pleaser's shadow contains rage. The caretaker's shadow contains selfishness. The strong one's shadow contains vulnerability. The peacekeeper's shadow contains aggression. These are not flaws. They are amputated pieces of a whole person. Reclaiming them feels like reaching into a wound. The pain of shadow work comes from a clash between who you believe you are and who you actually are. You've been telling yourself a story about your identity for years. I am kind. I am patient. I never get angry. Then individuation reveals a moment you acted cruelly but ignored it, the times your patience masked cowardice, and the rage you buried so deeply it manifests as passive aggression, chronic illness, or sudden outbursts that shock even you. Facing this doesn't feel like growth. It feels like realizing you're the villain in a story you believed you were the hero of. Jung described patients undergoing true shadow integration as experiencing a form of moral vertigo. Everything they thought they knew about themselves, their goodness, their intentions, their relationships, was suddenly questioned, not because they were bad people, but because they were finally seeing themselves as whole people. And whole people contain everything: generosity and selfishness, compassion and cruelty, love and indifference. This is where most people instinctively try to stop the process. Confronting the shadow is so destabilizing that the psyche cries out for relief. Retreat to persona. Return to performance. At least the false self was comfortable. At least you knew who you were, even if that knowledge was an illusion. Jung referred to this as the regression temptation, and he observed many patients fall into it. They would approach genuine integration, then retreat into the familiar false self, because the truth of who they really were felt unbearable. But Jung also noted that once the shadow has been seen, you can't unsee it. The persona never fits the same way again. You might try to resume the performance, but now you know it's a performance. You might attempt to return to unconsciousness, but awareness has no reverse gear. This leaves you in what Jung considered the most painful psychological state. Too aware to go back, too frightened to move forward, suspended between the death of who you were and the birth of who you are becoming, belonging fully to neither. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, featuring 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by Carl Jung's teachings, designed to help you navigate your inner journey. Click below to access True Self-Discovery. The third loss that makes becoming yourself so painful is the one Jung considered the most devastating and least understood: the loss of belonging. When you begin individuation, you don't just shed a false self. You lose your place in every system that relied on that false self to function. Your family assigned you a role. Your friendships were built around specific dynamics. Your workplace valued a particular version of you. Your romantic relationship depended on patterns you followed without question. And as you start becoming authentic, every one of these systems feels a disruption. Jung described the individuating person as a foreign body in their own life. Family members begin treating you differently because you no longer play the role they expected. Friends grow uncomfortable as a dynamic shift. Colleagues struggle to relate without the familiar persona. And the people closest to you often respond not with support, but with resistance, because your transformation threatens a balance they depend on. This isn't about them being bad people. It's about how systems naturally resist change. Jung understood that relationships function as psychological ecosystems. Everyone has a role, and everyone plays a part. When one person changes at a fundamental level, the entire system is unsettled. The family scapegoat who stops taking the blame disrupts how the family manages shame. The caretaker who stops self-sacrificing removes a resource everyone depended on. The peacekeeper who begins speaking the truth challenges the illusion of harmony everyone worked to maintain. The pain here isn't just interpersonal. It's existential. Belonging is a basic human need. We are wired for connection, for inclusion, and for the sense that we have a place among others. Individuation temporarily strips that away. You no longer fit where you once did, and you haven't yet found where you belong as the person you are becoming. Jung called this the liminal space, the threshold between your old identity and the new, where you belong nowhere. This is where the loneliness can feel nearly unbearable. Not the social kind, but something deeper. The isolation of being mid-transformation in a world that has no framework for your experience. You can't explain it to those around you because they see the changes as problems. They say you're becoming distant, selfish, or not yourself. And they're right. You're not yourself anymore. But the self you're leaving behind was never truly you, and the self you are becoming hasn't fully arrived. You exist in an agonizing gap where no version of yourself feels stable or real. Jung observed that this liminal period is where most transformations stall or collapse. Not for lack of courage or insight, but because the isolation is too intense. Humans aren't built to endure prolonged disconnection from belonging. So people often compromise. They become partially authentic, real enough to gain some relief from persona, but not so real that they completely lose their place in the systems around them. Jung called these individuals half-individuated. Jung considered the position of the half-individuated more painful than either full unconsciousness or full individuation. They could see clearly that they were compromising, yet they couldn't bear the cost of going all the way. During this phase, Jung emphasized the importance of what he called a container, some structure or relationship that could hold the transformation without resisting it. For some patients, that container was therapy itself. For others, it was a single relationship with someone able to witness the process without flinching. For a few, it was creative expression that provided an outlet for the transformation beyond internal pressure. The key point: individuation cannot occur in complete isolation, even though it feels profoundly lonely. You need at least one witness, one person or practice that says, "I see this happening, and I'm not turning away." But Jung was brutally honest about one thing. Even with a container, even with support, the process still hurts. There is no way to become yourself comfortably. You can't integrate your shadow gently, and you can't shed your persona without feeling exposed. The pain isn't a sign that you're doing it wrong. It is a process. Anyone claiming that transformation should feel like pure joy, expansion, or flow is selling you another persona to replace the one that's dying. This is what few people are told. The self-help world frames personal growth as addition. You add mindfulness, gratitude, or better habits. You become an improved version of who you already are. Individuation, however, isn't addition. It's subtraction. It's loss. It's the systematic stripping away of everything you are not, leaving only what you truly are. And that stripping doesn't feel liberating while it's happening. It feels like destruction. Jung observed that patients who understood this paradox navigated the process differently, not with less pain, but with less panic. When you understand that dissolution is part of the design, you stop interpreting it as failure. When you see grief as evidence of real change rather than proof that something is wrong, you can hold it without being consumed. When you recognize that the loneliness is temporary, even when it feels permanent, you can endure it without retreating into a false self just to escape the isolation. Jung also observed that the quality of the pain changes as individuation progresses. In the early stages, it is sharp. The acute loss of identity, the shock of confronting your shadow, the sudden fractures in relationships. As integration deepens, however, the pain shifts. It becomes a tender ache, like muscles adjusting to carry weight differently. It is no longer the agony of destruction, but the discomfort of reconstruction. You are being rebuilt from the inside, and the new structure hasn't fully set. Everything feels raw, exposed, and unfamiliar, but the panic begins at ease because beneath the unfamiliarity, you sense something solid forming that was never there before. Jung described this as the emergence of the self, with a capital S, the deeper center of the psyche beneath the persona, the ego, and all constructed identities. The self doesn't need to perform, doesn't seek approval, and doesn't need to fit into systems built on falsehood. The self simply is. Making contact with it, even briefly, brings a quiet certainty. Everything you've lost was worth losing, because what's emerging is real in a way nothing before ever was. But Jung warned against romanticizing this emergence. It doesn't appear as a dramatic, triumphant moment. There's no soundtrack, no sudden revelation that makes all the suffering instantly meaningful. The self emerges gradually, often imperceptibly, like dawn arriving so slowly you can't pinpoint when darkness became light. You just notice, at some point, that your decisions are guided by authenticity rather than performance. Your relationships have become smaller, but honest. You no longer seek validation from people whose approval required you to abandon yourself. The weight you carried for years has lifted, not because problems vanished, but because you stopped carrying burdens that were never yours. This is what becoming yourself looks like on the other side. Not a dramatic transformation into an elevated being, but quiet arrival into someone you recognize as real. Someone whose choices reflect their true values rather than survival strategies. Someone who can sit in silence without anxiety because they are no longer running from what's inside. Someone whose relationships are built on mutual authenticity, not mutual performance. If you are in the middle of this process, Jung will want you to know the pain you are feeling has a name, a structure, and a purpose. It is not random suffering. This is not a sign of weakness, failure, or pathology. It is a specific, documented, and predictable experience for anyone undergoing individuation. Every person who has ever genuinely become themselves has passed through this territory. The grief, the shadow confrontation, the loss of belonging, the liminal isolation. These are the price of admission to your own life. Here's what Jung observed about those who made it through. They didn't succeed because they were stronger than others, nor because they possessed some rare quality others lacked. They made it through by refusing to interpret the pain as a reason to stop. They continued to be honest, even when every part of them screamed to resume the performance. They sat in the loneliness without letting it convince them that connection was only possible through falseness. They trusted that the process had a destination. Even when it was invisible, you are not falling apart. You are falling into yourself. And the pain of that falling is the most reliable evidence that the ground you land on will be real. Everything before this was built on someone else's blueprint for who you should be. What is forming now, in the wreckage of that borrowed design, is the first structure that is truly yours. It may not be polished, impressive to others, or earn the same approval, but you'll be able to live in it without the constant, exhausting work of pretending it fits when it never did. This is what no one tells you about becoming yourself. Not that it's beautiful, not that it's enlightening, not that it feels like coming home. Those things may be true eventually, but at first, it feels like losing everything. Like the ground beneath you is giving way, like being asked to trust a process that, from the inside, feels indistinguishable from destruction. Jung devoted his life to studying this transformation, and the most important insight he discovered wasn't a technique, a concept, or framework. It was a simple, devastating, and ultimately liberating truth. The pain of becoming yourself is not an obstacle to your transformation. It is the transformation. The only way through is through. If you haven't already, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, featuring 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by Carl Jung's teachings, designed to help you navigate your inner journey. Click below to access True Self-Discovery.